Hello. Hello. Hello guys, and welcome to another episode of my photography vlog. In today's video, I want to talk about what is aperture. I have already talked about one of the factors of exposure of your camera, which is the ISO. So if you haven't able to see it, so the link is in the description below. You can check that out. This video, I want to talk about what is aperture. So when you say aperture, first off, I just want to clear things that this is according to what I know. When I'm explaining things here, there are a lot of things, or let's say a professional way how to explain things which is more complicated. In this kind of topic, I just want to make it very simple as possible so that people can understand what I'm talking about, especially for those people who are just trying to get or jump into photography, so that people will be able to understand what I'm talking about here. Because if I'm going to say something that is a little bit technical, of course it's going to be a little bit overwhelming, or not all people are familiar when it comes to technicality with photography. So I just want to make it as simple as possible. Aperture is one of the three factors that create an exposure. Understanding the exposure and the use of the exposure will help us to get an even exposed photos more easier. And in this video, I'm also going to tackle the different uses of a different aperture. You can make it into something of a creative way. First off, what exactly is an aperture? So when you say aperture, you can just imagine your eyes. It's like a pupil of your eye. If you go outside, of course, it's going to constrict, right? It has to compensate with the environment, or else you're going to be blind. But if you are in a very dark environment, your eyes are going to dilate. When you say aperture, this is the opening of your lens. So you got to remember, the wider the opening of your lens from both ends, from this one here, from the front elements to this part here that attaches to the camera, the more light is going in your sensor. Okay, so your sensor are going to take in all the lights that your lens is capturing. Together, the aperture, the ISO, and the shutter speed produce an exposure as the diameter of the aperture changes, allowing more or less light onto the sensor depending on the situation. So now, how is the aperture measured and changed? Aperture is measured using something called the f-stop. If you can see on your camera, f followed by the number. The number denotes how wide the aperture in which by a number in turns affect the exposure and depth of field. So you have to remember, the lower the number, the wider the opening, or the lower the number, the wider the aperture. This may seem confusing at times, especially if you are just beginning into photography, because how come that the smaller the number, the wider the aperture, and also the more light is going into the sensor? It's just some kind of a reverse. So actually there is a mathematical explanation and as well as scientific explanation regarding that one, but I don't want to tackle it because my head hurts. So the most important thing to know about the numbers is that from each number to the next, the aperture decreases to half its size, allowing 50% less light through the lens. So now, how does the aperture affect exposure? Well, that is very easy to understand, that the wider the aperture, the more light is going to get inside your camera sensor, and of course the more exposed the photo will be. The best way to demonstrate this is that I'm going to take a series of pictures. So as you can see in those photos, the images were taken at constant ISO 200 and the shutter speed 1 to 400 of a second without a flash. Only the aperture changes throughout. Now, what is the depth of field, and how is the aperture is going to affect the depth of field? Now, when you say depth of field, that actually the depth of field is kind of a big topic, but to summarize it, it is by saying that it is about the distance at which the subject will stay in focus in front of and behind the main point of focus. So you have to remember that the wider the aperture, the shallower the depth of field, vice versa. So the narrower the aperture, the wider the depth of field, or the deeper the depth of field. Here are the photos that is taken on the aperture priority mode so that the exposure remains constant and the only changing variable is the aperture. The ISO is still the same, ISO 200. The shutter speed is also changing together with the aperture so that it compensates exposure. So now, what are the uses of the different apertures? So the first thing to note is that there is no exact rules regarding of uses of the different apertures, but this is just a guide that I'm going to give to you now. For example, aperture ranges from 1.2 to f2. That is actually very good for low light and usually uses, let's say, for macro shots or for portraiture. f2.8, that is also good for portraiture because it's going to give a lot of definition to the physical features of the subject. And also the usual good zoom lenses has the widest 2.8 aperture. So in f4 you can also use that for portraiture, but you have to make sure that you have a decent light. f1.6, this is good for photographing two-person or couples. Not very good for low light though, so it's best if you're going to use a bounce flash. f8 to f11, these apertures are actually good for group photos because in this aperture you have a very narrow aperture. At the same time, you can make sure that all the persons in the photos are in focus. f16 to f22, I usually use this aperture if I want to have some kind of a landscape photography. You want to capture all the details from the landscape. I hope that you find this video informative. I'm trying to explain as simple as I can. So I hope to see you again soon. If you like my video, please like and consider subscribing for another or for my upcoming videos about my photography or about photography. So in my next photography vlog, I will be talking about shutter speed. And that would be all for now. Thank you very much, guys. I really appreciate the subscribers that I have right now. Right? So thank you very much, guys. So I have to say goodbye for now. See you.